Hello, Doug, you're not in the wrong place.
I'm sorry. I thought you said
Oh,
350, and I got like, oh no, I'm in the wrong room.
no, you did. I did. And then it went, so the keynote went so far over, and I'm doing the closing remarks, so I wanted to make sure I heard.
Understood. I had them on my other device. I was listening as well.
Oh, good. Oh, I could have been smarter. Yeah.
Are you all ready for me to let people in?
Yep.
All right.
Oh, welcome. All right, our 3 panelists are here. That's good news. Welcome, Brent, Doug, and Annie.
Hello.
Hello.
We'll wait for
Hello.
to populate. Hello, Alan.
Hi, good to see you, Kelly.
Excellent. You'll have the choice of doing a speaker view or gallery view. I always like gallery view, be able to see everybody. Hello, Peter. We're gonna, I see some people that are, that will have many things to add to this conversation, in addition to our folks. All right. Well, it is 4 o'clock, and so I'm going to get started. And we have a great group, and if people join further, we will welcome them in. So welcome to our session. I'm Kelly Young. I'm the president of Education Reimagined. We're one of the folks on the design team for this summit. So we're really glad that you're joining us. And this particular panel discussion is on illuminating the opportunities for states and districts to create adaptable systems that enable learner-centered learning. And I think the keynotes session was a great introduction to what we really want to dig into on this session. I was really struck by kind of 2 main themes coming out of the keynote. One was the humanity, the importance of allowing kids to have their own humanity, to know themselves, to be in their community, to contribute to the world in ways that create a socially just world. And then the other thing that you'll hear us talking about is I also loved stop doing the things that don't make a difference for kids, right? So, and then the question is, what do we put in their place? What are we inventing? So the goal of this particular panel discussion, I will introduce our 3 panelists in just a moment, is to first, we're going to hear kind of what are people hearing in terms of state and districts openness and availability and interest in innovation. First of all, just kind of see a lay of the land. Then we're going to spend a little bit of time thinking about like what are the to imagine what could be before we get into policies and systems and structures. If you don't have an image of where you're headed and what great learning looks like that you're trying to support, all you can do is really iterate away from something. And iterating away from something, unfortunately, doesn't actually get away from it. It just kind of piles on, leaving the basic inequitable structures, right, of ranking and sorting kids, of compliance driven, of transfer of content knowledge, right? So we know that we're not interested, right, in continuing that kind of system. But if we don't name and can have a visual of what we want, it's very hard for states and districts to move forward. So this is about how do we enable learner-centered education. And I think you guys all heard some wonderful descriptions of what learner-centered is, but it's seeing each child as unique, capable, curious, and wondrous, right? Truly seeing learning as a phenomenon that is a natural phenomenon that starts with kids' interests, curiosities, passions, and aspirations, and that the purpose of education is that kids discover who they are, their unique gifts, and how to contribute those meaningfully to the world. So I'm pleased today to be joined by three amazing panelists. First, Annie Homles, if you just kind of wave your hand, Annie, welcome. So Annie Homles is the Chief Equity Officer at the Council for Chief State School Officers, CCSSO, and has almost 2 decades of experience in fighting for equity across higher education, K through 12 education, and community development financing. She's an advisor to state chiefs in their offices across the country, and she and under her supervision is the Innovation Lab Network, which is a consortium of states that have signed up specifically to find the nexus of equity and learner-centered education. So welcome, Annie. We also have Doug Schuch. If you can wave your hand also. Excellent. He's the superintendent of Bedford County Public Schools, and he's in Virginia and has been there since 2009. And he's a passionate leader for learner-centered education. He's been an administrator in 3 Virginia public school districts. And he's also currently the president of the Virginia Association of School Superintendents. So is lobbying and represents superintendents on state legislative work. And lastly is Brent McKim. You raise your hand. There he is, excellent. Brent was a classroom physics teacher for 15 years. He is now the president of the Jefferson County Teachers Association, and he's been the president since 2001. He lobbies the state legislature on behalf of teachers, and he's also the president of the National Council of Urban Education Associations, a consortium of large NEA affiliates, so all of the large affiliates in urban and suburban areas. So welcome. And the first question, and I'll pass these each to each of you. So just like to, Annie, I'd love to start with you. What are you hearing about the appetite for innovation among states, and specifically for really thinking about learners, this intersection of equity and learner-centered education?
Thank you, Kelly. I'm excited to be with you all today. So yes, I agree with Kelly. I think the panel that we just had was a great segue into this conversation. What we're hearing from states, and so the Council of Chief State School Officers, for those who may not be familiar with us, we work with all of the state departments of education. And so our primary lever within those systems are the state chiefs, the superintendents, commissioners, and secretaries of education. We also work with SEA staff throughout. And so when Kelly mentioned our Innovation Lab Network, which is now transitioned to our student-centered learning collaborative, we're engaging with folks who are the directors of innovation or chief innovation officers for the states. And so what we're hearing from them, as well as what we're hearing from chiefs, is that folks are trying to tap into innovation. They recognize, I think everyone recognizes now that we are not going to go back to whatever learning looked like pre-COVID. And so given this timing that we have right now, folks are looking into how can we do things differently. And I mean different other than transitioning in-class learning to remote or distance learning. But states are really asking the question, how can we do things differently? So we can't, everyone got the waiver for this academic year to ensure that they would not be dinged for not doing assessments. But folks, we've actually started to build out a scope of work around innovative assessment and taking it a bit beyond formative assessment, right? And so recognizing that formative assessment is a part of it, but if we're really truly going to understand what the new normal in learning looks like, there are multiple things that we need to engage in recognizing that learning is not one way. It's not, these are things that those of us that have been in the educational equity space for years have been talking about, but states are truly recognizing and understanding that we need to look more holistically at learning, what learning is, the purpose of education. And so it's interesting that that's one of those questions where you ask different people, what's the purpose of education? You're going to get different answers from everybody. And so getting folks to recognize and understand that states actually are ready for something new, whatever that new normal is. They want to be at the forefront of helping to create the new normal, but we also recognize that there are bureaucracies and red tape that can hinder from a chief saying, yes, we need to be innovative, down to what actually is being implemented within the classroom or from teachers. And so states are recognizing that there are multiple layers to this conversation and are actively having being a part of the conversation. So yeah, states are ready. They have been asking us to help support them and how they can support local education agencies, schools, and districts, and leaders throughout kind of that education spectrum. But they're looking for the kind of, I would say, tried and trusted avenues and opportunities to bring in what we've been talking about as innovation and equitable access to high quality instructional or instruction, not just a nice education, but recognizing that we are still pushing for high quality instruction for all children so that they can all be successful, have access to different opportunities, explore the world, explore what is before them and what they can do. And so I would say that states are listening. They're having those conversations, just as Lynn pointed out about students reaching out to her. The states are listening. State chiefs are having conversations with families during this time and recognizing that, in the fall when schools restart, because we're not going to say reopen, this is not going to be the only time we'll need to look at that this is actually an integral time for us to engage in education transformation. And I would say, folks have been talking about education reformation for a long time, but folks are recognizing it's time to transform the system, and being able to identify opportunities within the current system to start to create the change from within, to create that outward change is critical and crucial.
Thank you, Annie. And Brent and Doug, you both are, Brent in Kentucky and Doug in Virginia. I'd love to hear from your vantage point. Brent, would you like to go first?
Sure. Thank you, Kelly, for the opportunity to be part of this panel and part of this discussion. I really appreciate it. To give a little more context, I am a teacher and a full-time local association president in Louisville, Kentucky, where we have about 100,000 students in our school district. So we're a pretty large district, and I represent about 6,500 teachers, classroom teachers in that district. I think one thing that that has unmistakably occurred as a result of the coronavirus school closures that we've all experienced is it has disrupted the status quo. And it's really the move toward having to approach things from a distance learning perspective, I think has the potential to be a constructive disruptor of what has been the status quo, because if you were in a sort of test prep, prescriptive, basic skills kind of scenario that was sort of drill and practice and so forth, that's just not possible. It doesn't work. Now in our district, with a lot of hard work on the part of the Teachers Association, we had actually incorporated into our district's strategic plan a move toward deeper personalized learning. But what we found is putting it into a strategic plan and actually realizing it are two very different things. We were able to achieve a really important step in that direction by establishing a deeper learning team of resource teachers for the district. But I think most teachers today, if you think about it, have not really experienced deeper personalized student-centered learning. They may have come up through a No Child Left Behind experience and gone into schools of education where that was the norm for which they were prepared. So they haven't seen Socratic approaches. They haven't experienced firsthand and been trained to do sort of interdisciplinary kinds of approaches. And we have been encouraging that, promoting it with some success, but I think going to the distance learning has created a scenario where we have been able to show teachers how you can create an interdisciplinary project that is simultaneously accomplishing important learning for social studies and math and science, what have you, at the same time. Whereas the old mode of thinking, I think a lot of our teachers were saying, I don't have time to do all these projects and all these different disciplines. They're able to start to see if they work together, if they collaborate, if they make them interdisciplinary. When they are doing one, they are doing all. And I think it's been a real enlightening moment for them. And I think it creates an opportunity when we move beyond this to build on that and create much more of a buy-in among classroom educators. So I think it really is an opportunity to move us toward project-based, interdisciplinary, learner-centered, constructivist methods because it's disrupted the status quo.
Fabulous. Thank you, Brent. And Doug, from the Virginia perspective.
Thank you, Kelly, and thanks to everyone that chose this breakout session. I know you had a lot of other choices. I guess I'll start by saying I agree with Annie and I agree with Brent, so I don't want to repeat anything that either of them shared. But from my perspective, which is one that is very hopeful and opportunistic, I still have a degree of skepticism that when states and districts talk about wanting to be innovative, they may not really know what transformation to a learner-centered future means for the system. And what I mean by that is I think districts are more apt to jump into innovations that layer upon the current system, but still keep the current system fundamentally the way it's been for over 100 years. And I think the opportunity we all have is to say, because of this disruption, is there a better way? And I think we heard that from some of our keynotes, from our young learner, Gemma, and from the others. And so I guess the cautionary note to all of us that are optimistic and opportunistic is that we understand that No Child Left Behind, I feel, was a very well-meaning strategy. And its strategy really was to combat inequities. And so I don't believe the hearts of the educators are any different then than they are now, or the people that are making those decisions. Having said all that, I think these structures, and I'm talking even pre-No Child Left Behind structures, but the way that we tend to do things in school and have, again, for the past 100 years or so, those things are very difficult for people to consider not being part of the school experience. It even challenges me and maybe many of us because it's our normal. And so the other side of it too is, as we talk about states and districts, and Annie may know more about this from working with many more states. I certainly primarily work with one. State departments of education and even districts, ours is about 10,000 learners, have really organized and put a lot of resources, human resources and other resources, into making children successful on test scores and trying to meet these state and federal mandates. And so one of the things I think we have to realize is if we're going to pave this new way forward, those folks need to be convinced not only is it good for children, but that they're going to have a role in that future. And so if not, they're going to fight us and come up with all kinds of reasons that sound really good for children. But on some level, any type of system change or paradigm change that we're kind of advocating for may threaten a lot of people's livelihoods and careers. And that does include a whole bunch of teachers too, as Brent was saying. And so I think our goal is not just to advocate for the change, but to bring all those people along with us so we're doing it together.
Beautiful. And so as each one of you were talking, you were hinting at this next question. So there are all kinds of things that we've always taken for granted around education. And if we're going to create new ways of organizing, supporting, and credentialing learning, we actually have to let go of things first. And so I'm going to ask each of you, what is one or two things that people have the chance of letting go that are so the taken for granted systems, right? So a couple have been mentioned that are not so taken for granted, like accountability, but also the ones of, grouping kids by age, for example. So there's a lot of these. So if each of you could say, you'd start with one and we'll go around and we might go around twice. What is one thing that you would hope that people would let go of, and other options they could be considering for serving that, for replacing that custom? And I think I'll just go backwards this time. So Doug, if you want to start, and then we'll do Brent.
Sure, thank you, Kelly. And again, I've got about a dozen in mind, but I'll stick to just one in the interest of time. And actually, time is at the heart of what I want to speak to. I believe that one of the things that operates in the background of our system, and sometimes we don't even notice it, is how tied schools traditionally have been to the concept of time. And whether we've articulated this or not, that somehow the time we spend in school equates to the learning that we achieve. And our systems are all based on that. And I don't think we should be too critical of that system. It had its roots in the industrial age when the economy was primarily a time-based economy, and that people were paid, like many of them are today, based on the hours that they put in. And so when you translate that to learning, it doesn't always make sense for the individual learner that spending a year, say in an algebra class or a physics class, since we have Brent and I was a former physics teacher as well, necessarily equates to a quantity of learning. But we're so married to these schedules, it's very difficult, for example, for a high school teacher or an administrator or learner or parent to envision not going to school and attending multiple classes and having some schedule where everybody is kind of efficiently moved through the system. And I think what COVID has done in our district, in our state, and I'm guessing across most of the country and maybe most of the world, is said now there is no schedule per se, and time doesn't really matter. So learning can now occur one learner at a time. So if I only need 3 months to master algebra, but somebody else actually needs 9 months and somebody else needs 15, why isn't that okay? But to do that, we'd have to be willing to set aside that master schedule and really think about not just time, but also how teachers are assigned to individual learners and how learners can progress. So that's kind of a lot there, but the main thing is rethinking time.
Beautiful. Brent?
Yes, well, I'll share two things that are related so I can do kind of two at once. I think we really need to let go of our historic mental model for assessment, particularly, and maybe not so much the people on this particular Zoom meeting, but policymakers and district officials and so forth. When you say assessment, I think that has traditionally been defined as a set of questions that are on paper or on a computer screen, And that's our model for assessment. And I think we have to leave that behind and shift our thinking toward thinking of assessment as a practice that professional educators do and that they can do well. And it's not something you do with pencil or paper or picking a multiple choice answer on a computer screen. It's something that it requires the professional judgment of a skilled educator. And if we are able to make that shift in our paradigm for what we mean when we say assessment, that's kind of at a micro level. So that my second part is at a state policy level, that would mean shifting our thinking about what the currency in state accountability systems is from cheap multiple choice tests, at least cheap on a per student basis. They're expensive when you do an entire statewide allotment of them. But if we shift our thinking about assessment for accountability purposes from something that is pencil and paper or on a screen to what teachers are capable of doing, and make locally designed, authentic assessments designed by classroom teachers the way that we address the assessment of learning, I think that's really powerful. And I think there are ways that we can do that. Classroom educators are capable of, with some guidance and training, they can design, implement, and score assessments every bit as reliably as a computer or a Scantron form can from a third-party vendor, but with much higher quality and more seamlessly integrated into a much more enriching experience for learners. So I think making that shift from something that is other than the educator to assessment being by the educator, and maybe teachers, for example, are able to achieve a certification in evaluation that shows that they can reliably create and score assessments in a way that you could use them for state accountability purposes, and you wouldn't need the state high stakes test that sort of pulls everything down to the lowest common denominator. If you can remove that state multiple choice test, it is the linchpin that holds almost everything that is bad in place in the current paradigm. So I think that's just key.
Awesome. Yes, and I think you heard some of that in the keynote as well, and might be the topic of the next summit. Just giving a preview. Annie.
Yes. So I love the way Doug started us off when he talked about kind of the concept of time and how we look at time and learning. Because I think honestly, us getting back down to the core of learning and how learning actually occurs, and leveraging that within the K-12 system. And so for me, I think if we could shift the understanding of learning, that learning is not one way, and from an equity lens, to be able to see that the cultural relevance of family makeup, of family history, where one grows up is actually a value to that person. And so we can start to pour into children, I think, at a much younger age about the fact that their experiences should be brought into the learning environment and not set at the door as the children enter their learning environment. And the reason I lean in here is, I think back to when I first graduated from college, and my thesis in undergrad was all children can learn. And it wasn't, at the time, I didn't have the language around diversity, equity, and inclusion, but I was really leaning in on, doing a lot of my practicums throughout the city of Philadelphia. My student teaching was done in North Philadelphia. And so being able to see the dynamics that the students were bringing to the classroom, that were part of who they are. The first grader that I had in my first classroom who wouldn't come to school because he was taking care of his younger brother, bathing him and things like that, taking care of, Maslow's hierarchy of needs at 5 years old for himself and his younger brother. That helps me to think through. So that child has resilience like no other, right? Like that child already has capabilities and strength and knowledge and wisdom, probably, even at the age of 5, given what he was responsible for during that time. But instead, we separate our own cultural programming from learning, and we say, no, you sit that aside and pay attention to what we want you to learn. And so I think what COVID has shown for us is, of course, the challenges for those of us even who do have degrees and try to homeschool our own children right now, but recognizing that when children come into a learning environment, they're bringing their identity, characteristics with them. They're bringing so much with them. And instead of us bringing that into the learning environment to help them to cultivate and curate learning for themselves and experiences and opportunities, we try to set that aside. And so I think there's a value that we could see even at the state level in recognizing that all students deserve the opportunity to recognize that they bring something to the table when it comes to learning. We hear the frustration, especially I would say in the middle school, high school ages, and it's not only because I have a middle schooler and a high schooler in my house, but I hear from that age range all the time about, they have something of value to bring as well. And putting a worksheet in front of me, telling me to read a textbook and answer the worksheet is not preparing me for my future. And so giving those children the opportunity to share their voices, to help shape what that could look like. And granted, I think we all become, like I think about Paulo Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed. And I think sometimes as adults, we become the oppressor, right? Like when we were kids, there were moments where we didn't like our teacher or, had a difficult time with the subject, but we were just told, well, you sit down and you figure it out. And if you were privileged enough to have access to tutors and things like that, you were given those opportunities. But we need, and now we are the adults telling kids, okay, sit down, shut up and listen and learn what I'm trying to teach you, rather than hearing from them, learning from them. And so I think that's the one place and space where if we could truly get back to learning and looking at the data that shows there's been a ton of research around how different people learn. And so it's not just, textile or you're a visual learner, but recognizing that the life experiences that we bring into the classroom or the learning environment are extremely important. And the last thing I'll share is, I think about my trajectory through school. And it wasn't until either I was in my major courses in undergrad, but primarily it wasn't until when I got to grad school that it was more of an environment where folks got to share their perceptions of the reading or, the critical thinking. And we know that, that builds through K-12, but how many teachers out there are actually creating an environment where students get to just share their experiences, share their thoughts, share their perspectives on the learning? That's how we can build out critical thinking. That's how we can build out some of the experiences that students need in order to be successful for post-secondary access, whatever that is, if that's 2-year, if that's CTE, if that's the armed forces, whatever that might be. Are we truly centering the learner and recognizing that this is not just a one-way street? You are to, do as I say, not as I do type of thing, but that we are really truly helping students to explore, helping them, I think about Latinx families and how they embrace the family and how learning is actually very important within those communities. But because of the way we have westernized the education system, we tend to say that those culturally relevant practices and even pedagogies, I'd put myself out there to say, even the cultural pedagogies that are happening at home should be of value when students are being brought together. So learning not being one way, recognizing informal, formal, and non-formal learning as being of value in the K-12 system. We see it in adult ed, and I say that because that's where my graduate work is in, but we don't talk about it enough in K-12, and we should.
Beautiful. And I know you all have others, and I might bring, just because I heard some of you in advance, but just to just rename some of the ones that we just talked about. And Annie, I loved the ones you were talking about, like, so leaving behind that what learning is right, is absorbing what the teacher gives you, but that it's a two-way, right? And it's a communal thing, which also rethinks where the subject matter is coming from, right? Right now, the subject matter is coming from teacher to student, right? As opposed to the subject matter is coming in with the young people. And also the pedagogies, right? And so rethinking the division between school and outside. So you named a whole bunch in there that were great. And we talked about time and assessment. And Doug, because I want to get to the third question, can you just really quickly say the one about transportation? Because the one that you mentioned was one kid to one building, right? As the possible thing to leave behind.
Sure. Yeah, just really quickly, we've talked a lot about inequities in this conversation and the keynote. And one of the things we discovered during this school closure is, even though we've distributed Chromebooks to all of our learners grades 6 through 12, and even many in elementary that wanted it, the home internet access is an issue. So the big picture rethink is that learning only occurs in the classroom or in the assigned school. And one of our thoughts would be, if what we return to is still some combination of remote learning and in-person learning, which I personally hope it is. I don't think it should be all one or all the other. How do we address the inequities of the child that really doesn't have that internet access at home? And so one of our brainstorms, we're not doing this yet, please don't publish it, is what if we had a different transportation routing system that would allow learners to maybe not always go to the same building, but go to the one that is most convenient and access the broadband internet connection that we've spent so much time and money beefing up inside of all of our school buildings, with the original thought that certain kids would be there all day long during certain times. But what if we kind of blew that up and said, we have all these buildings, we have all this internet connection, we have all these buses, maybe we can eliminate some of these inequities, or at least minimize them by leveling that playing field and opening that up. That's something we've never done. And it might be seen controversial about, say, a 10th grader attending an elementary school for a few hours to get internet access. But I feel like we have to push these boundaries, or we're never going to address these inequities.
And what that also makes me think of is that there's no reason that learning has to come from the educators in a particular building, right? We've got all of these things tied to a specific building, that learning happens there with the people assigned to that building, right? And that you have to go there to get that learning, right? And all of those things now can begin to be unbundled and then rebundled in ways that really work for kids. So the last question is, so what, given all of this, right, these leave behinds and these opportunities, what are the opportunities for states and districts to organize, support, and credential learning differently? And also, some of you may have some ideas for what people on this call could be doing to influence that. And I should pick somebody. Since Brent, you haven't started. So Brent, why don't you go first?
All right, thank you. I'm going to build a little on my last answer to my last question, because I do think we have a period of time where we have an opportunity to start to impact state policy around state accountability systems, to create more space for all of the other things that we were talking about. And in particular, something that I think is practical and potentially doable would be to build in an opportunity in state accountability policy for a local school district or a set of schools within a local school district, maybe not the entire district, to request the authority to implement an alternative accountability assessment system that is locally designed, authentic, project-based sorts of assessments. We could build in assurances on the part of the schools and the districts that perhaps they partner with a higher ed institution to validate that their assessment system is rigorous and meaningful and comparable to the state system, but it wouldn't look like the state system. It would be about empowering individual educators in their classroom to be able to design really high quality assessments that can be scored with inter-rater reliability and so forth, so that you know that what those scores mean is meaningful and can be used for an accountability context. I think we have an opportunity, perhaps if we don't have in next spring an accountability assessment as well, we have time that we could build that in, and school districts with schools that are interested in moving away from what we have had since 2001 and No Child Left Behind to something that allows the seamless integration of assessment with really engaging learner-centered teaching practices is a real opportunity that we have. And it's a way that I think we can create the space to do so many of the other things that we are talking about that so many districts don't feel like they can do because they are so constrained by the one-size-fits-all state multiple choice test.
Yeah, excellent. Annie and then Doug.
Sure. So my response to the opportunities for states and districts to organize, support, and credential learning differently is about collective action. And so it's a little bit of what Brent said, but I want to expand on that a little bit. So from a state level, oftentimes we hear from SEAs that they're a local control state and the districts want the SEA to be hands-off in some ways. But what we have found is that if the SEA, the state education agency, actually helps to support at the LEA level, then they can bring about a stronger relationship from state to district and district to state. So I would say that where I have seen great movement is in states where they are drawing those connections from early childhood all the way up through higher education. And the ways in which they're doing it is they're bringing together district leaders and school leaders to be a part of the conversation so that it's not these siloed parts of education, but that folks are coming to the table and recognizing what, the North Star, the focus, the goal, and everyone is able to approach that goal. I've seen in some states where they have really excelled in that. Ohio is one, and I'll say specifically around math, because they were starting to recognize that not every child needed, calculus in high school if they were planning on, majoring in communications in college or go the CTE route. And so they took the time, and now we have nothing but time, right, to bring folks to the table and to start to have the conversation around pathways. And so I think as long as we can put politics aside, and I know, someone may tweet me that I said this, and that's okay. But if we can remember that there are kids at the end of this, and not our political stance, but that we truly are, as educators, coming to the table to ensure that every single child that is within our purview, so whether you work in a district, a state, nationally, every child within your purview deserves access to a high quality education and learning environment. And so I think if districts and states, school leaders, whomever else, community organizers, civil leaders can truly come together and set aside set aside bias, set aside, not to say set aside their own personal interests, but recognizing that they're viewing the conversation through that lens, owning that and calling that out at the table. And so if you have folks at the table that are advocating that more English language learners are considered in what remote and distance and virtual learning looks like, that voice needs to be at the table to help flesh through all of that. And so I truly believe that it's collective action, it's coming to the table, and it's not using politics to separate us, but actually putting politics aside to come together to have the stronger conversations. I also want to approach, there were a few comments or questions around micro-credentialing. Pre-COVID, we did have several states that were, New Jersey was one, Mississippi is another. I'm trying to think who might some others be, who were really at the forefront of micro-credentialing and looking at ways that they could assist, paraprofessionals to toward licensing and credentialing. And so states definitely are trying to work with their higher education partners on this. I would say deans of schools of education, faculty are all on board and want to be a part of the conversation. It's just a matter of, being having the convening to occur to bring everyone together. And so collective action, I think, is going to be critical and crucial for us to truly understand the needs, the pertinent needs, to then be able to identify what's the hindrance here. Is it what we've also found at the state level is sometimes folks will read a policy and they'll interpret it one way and not in the way that it was meant to be when it was written. And so clear communication, collective action, I think truly are ways in which we can shift to explore what are some of the things that need to happen in order for children to have access to high quality learning environments and experiences.
Awesome, Annie. And there have been a whole lot of questions and we've got about 2 minutes. So Doug, I'm going to give you the final word from the panel and then I'm going to address a handful of the things in the comment and close us out.
Sure. So probably have 30 minutes. I want to react to all of that, but I'll limit it to 2. And I've been reading the chat too. So thank you everyone for doing that. I think one of the things that, and I've just met Brent and Annie for the first time, but one of the things I think that we all have in common is that we all in some way represent adults in parts of the system. And one of the things that I constantly challenge our team to do here in Bedford County is to try to make all of our decisions based on the impact to learners. And that is very difficult when they don't have a voice at the table, whether it's in the state house, at the policymaker level, or within teacher organizations or district administrations. And so one thing I would suggest to the group is that you bring the learner voice in. And if that sounds weird or strange to you, once you do it, you'll begin questioning why you haven't done that all along. Our young people are very capable of telling us what's working and what's not working, and they can really help us move forward. And I think until we get past that, what we are going to see are incremental, what we'll call innovations, but they won't be the transformations that we really need. And I'll stop there in the interest of time.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And there are a whole lot of questions, and there are lots of systems that are right now ones that can be rethought. So in the chat, college university admissions, and we've seen the SAT and the ACT going away for many colleges right now, and even UC is proposing them going away perhaps forever, which would be a huge deal. But there are all kinds of systems at the moment, right, that we have the opportunity to rethink. And I think Annie's comments about bringing the diverse voices together on all of these things, there's an opportunity to be doing that, whether it's accountability assessment, how we credential the learning, how we organize the day, how we support our young learners with learner voice, et cetera. And so I just want to thank the 3 of you, Annie, Doug, and Brent, for a very rich conversation. I would love for this to go on much longer. And I know that there are so much wisdom in the group as well that we didn't get to cull out, but I appreciate all of you for coming and for participating. And we are going to, there's a closing remark at the end. I'm one of the closers, so so I encourage you to come to the final session. It's just for about 7 minutes, but you just go back to the Zoom link that you went to for the keynote, and that'll bring you back into the main room. So I look forward to seeing you there, and thank you all so much. Bye-bye.